Hello guys, and welcome to a new Wargame video today by me, Vulcan. Today we're going to be looking at the Nato Tanks. I was thinking of doing the Nato infantry and tanks, but I have a feeling I've got a lot to talk about when it comes to the tanks. So I wanted to do them separately. I hope you forgive me if you are looking forward to the infantry, but I think most of you are actually looking forward to the tanks. So hopefully a more in-depth look at the tanks will help you more than looking at both briefly. So anyway, let's get on with it. AMX-30B, first tank in the NATO armory. This is a weird tank. It has a couple of roles. The first is rushing. You can rush with this tank. The second is defending. There are three variants of this tank. The last variant, or the second two variants, actually have the upgraded range. One thing I've got to say before I really start to get into it is that all tanks used to have this range, 1925 meters. That's when the game came out. They did that for balance, but basically what it meant was that HGMs could snipe vehicles from miles away before tanks even got in range to fire back. And I complained about that, and a couple of other people joined me in complaining about that on the forum. And then eventually what they did is they added in a very long range. So if I go to the Challenger 1 just for a second, you can see they have 2,275 meter range. Now that was only implemented to the highest tanks, basically the most expensive tanks on the deck. And that meant that if you took those tanks, they weren't going to get sniped so easily by HGMs before you even got in range, which is an amazing difference. But now what they've done since is they've actually increased the range of sort of medium to heavy tanks. So now you can get tanks to 2,100 meter range as well, which is very, very useful. So anyway, going back to these tanks, AMX-30B has a main gun and an autocannon, making it very appealing to new players. And the reason I'm saying that is because people think that the more armament you have, the more powerful you are. But I would say that in this game specifically, you've got to use vehicles for their role and their role alone. You don't use a tank for multiple roles. That's where you lose out. Because if you've got, say, a tank and it's got like multiple roles, like the MBT-70, and you come up against a tank which is purely against tanks, or is meant to be used purely against tanks, then you're going to struggle a lot. And the trouble with that is that you're basically just going to die. So anyway, the MX-30B specifically is good for pushing forwards, and the reason for that is because it has 60 kilometers per hour, although you will have to be stationary to shoot with the first variant and the second variant and the third variant. They all don't have stabilizers. I actually thought the last one did have, but apparently none of them have stabilizers, which means this accuracy kind of becomes redundant on the move. And stabilizers are a very important thing in tanks. They tell you whether or not a tank is good at firing on the move. That's what stabilizer is used for. And also, if a tank is really fast, then it will need a better stabilizer to keep the accuracy high. So that's another thing. But anyway, the MX-30B has great accuracy at long range. So it's good for keeping a distance on your enemy, and the reason that's why I say it's good as a defensive vehicle. On the edge of forests, it can sort of shoot down sort of infantry rushes before they get anywhere near, and even if they do get near, then it's got that extra autocannon to help sort of suppress the charge. The AP power is not great, only having 5 on the first variant and 6 on the second variant and the third variant. So it's not great versus other tanks unless you're looking at light to medium tanks, like for instance the T-62 series on the Russians, or basically to clear out enemy tank rushes with T-34s or something like that. That's what these are good for attacking. And if the enemy is defending with infantry, HGMs, or light armor, then these tanks are good for rushing against that. That's why I say they're good at rushing. Some people wouldn't necessarily agree, but that's what I use them for, and I think they work out quite well. The only trouble with these is that you shouldn't get them into frontline combat with tanks because they don't have much armor at all. Only front armor of 3 side armor of 2, rear armor of 1. It's not very good. They have a great fuel capacity. They can go on forever. They are great for flanking if you get the chance. And yeah, that's basically the MX-30B. Good defensive and rushing tank, but you have to kind of be on the flanks to make them effective. The MX-32 kind of fills the same role. I haven't unlocked it myself, and the only reason I can say that I didn't unlock it was because this tank actually used to cost 100 points to bring in. Now it only costs 80, and I think that's actually since like the last patch they balanced that out, because not many people were using this tank because it was too expensive, and cutting 20 points off the price is very, very appealing to this tank. You've got a speed of 70, and a front armor of 5, accuracy of 10, an AP power of 9, and a normal stabilizer. And it's a stabilizer that makes it very good. Now with the stabilizer and the accuracy, it basically means that you can move quite a bit and still be reasonably accurate, which is what makes this tank very appealing for flanking and also just, well, being defensive in general. Sort of, if your enemies using tanks to push against you, these are good reactive forces to bring in, but they can also be used to attack at long distances because they do have that max range that they implemented basically once I complained. So they have the 2,275 meters, which basically means that they can fire at max range and kind of match 80 gems, which have, I think, about 300 more range. But basically the 80 gem jeeps in the forest will get sniped by these very easily if these things are stationary. So that's what they're good for. They're good for picking off enemies. They're kind of like, yeah, I would say that's basically their use. They do sort of flank quite a bit. I have talked about these tanks with the #1 player in the world quite a bit. So yeah, he used to use them, but he doesn't anymore. He kind of tried them out once with me, and well, it didn't go too well. Let's just put it that way. The Challenger 1, moving on to this tank, is my favourite tank in the game, and the reason being is because it's British and it's awesome. Now, the actual use of this tank is completely different to every other tank I've talked about so far. This is a slow pushing frontal assault tank. It has an accuracy of 9 and AP power of 9. This is actually one worse than most of the highest tanks on NATO side. There is only one tank which has 10 AP power, and that's the Leopard 2A4. But basically, the Challenger has a slow speed but a very good stabilizer, and that basically means that it can roll along. If you get, say, a couple of them, you just roll them forwards. They can take so much damage in the front armor and side armor because they have a side armor of 8, which is insane. And it basically means they can take about 1 or 2 80 gems in the front, an 80 gem in the side, and they'll be fine. They can keep rolling. They're a very good stabilizer, means they can fire on the move quite effectively. If you have a couple of them, their defensive line's not going to last very long. And yeah, they can basically just roll forwards and destroy everything in sight. Yeah, the only trouble is excessive 80 gems will destroy them very easily, and you're going to lose 140 points if you do, because they are very expensive, and that speed is not ideal for sort of moving them around the map. So if you are going to use these tanks, you've got to be very precise at what you're going to do with them before you bring them in, because otherwise you're going to bring them into somewhere and then you're going to be like, oh shit, I need them over here, and then they won't be able to get over there in time, and it'll be too late, and they become redundant. So yeah, you got to know what you're doing with these tanks. But they are very fun when you get to that position where they've got a few tanks defending and you just literally roll over them. It's quite funny. Moving on to the Chieftain Mark II. This is another good tank, but it's not really used a great amount. Basically, this is the T-72 equivalent on the NATO side. It's got low accuracy but high AP power, meaning it's good at close range. A good example of where this tank can come in very handy is if you hide it in, say, a forest and they start pushing towards it, and then you peekaboo it to the edge of the forest and sort of start attacking them then. That can be a very good way to do damage seriously with the Chieftain Mark II. Another thing you can do with them is use them behind ridges. So you get those like hills. You can put them on the top of the hills, and if anything comes over the hill, it will automatically be in range to take like max damage, and then you can just like rape it so easily. And that's what it's really good for. The front armor of 5 and the side armor of 4 makes it good against infantry and light vehicles, and also it means it can take like light tank shots in the front without really taking any serious damage. If you go from medium to heavy tanks though, they will start to do a serious amount to you, and the chieftains can die very easily if they bump into, for instance, a T-80, which will just own them completely. The Chieftain Mark 5 costs 10 more than the Chieftain Mark 2, but both having a better range. The basically has the second tier of range, the 2,100 meter range, and also has one front armor, but I wouldn't say this is really worth the 10 extra points that you're paying for, because they basically fill the same role. It's just that you're getting slightly longer range, which you don't need because the guns are inaccurate. And the front armor, yeah, like I say, it's not really needed against what you're going to be attacking with it. Now, the Chieftain Mark 10 is a completely different story. 75 points, but has an accuracy of 9. Now, this makes it good for attacking at a distance. It rolls very slowly, sort of similar to the Challenger 1. So, this is basically like a cheap version of the Challenger 1. Accuracy of 9, AP power of 8 is very, very good for the 75 cost. It's like almost half the cost of a Challenger 1. And yeah, it goes like 5 kilometers slower, I think. It goes 5 kilometers slower, but the trouble is with this tank is the armor. It goes too slow, and it can get caught out very easily because it is so slow. So again, this is one of those tanks where you have to be very precise about where you place it. You can spread them out, but they're better in groups because they can push forwards onto positions quite well with the high accuracy and the normal stabilizer they come with. The other two variants of the chieftains don't have stabilizers, which makes them more defensive troops than attacking troops, whereas the Chieftain Mark 10 can actually push forwards with its slow speed and still do a reasonable amount of damage. So that's the difference between the chieftain types. Now, moving on to the Leopards, I honestly can't say that I use these much. These are the first tanks you unlock when you get the game, and they're crap. Honestly, they basically are tanks which are too balanced and don't fill the specific role better than other tanks in the NATO deck. So, for instance, what I would compare the Leopards to is the patterns, and even though you can get very cheap like tanks with the Leopards, for instance, the Leopard 1A1 is only 25, kind of basically matches the stats of, say, a T-34-85, but costs 10 more, so it's not great. These tanks at the end of the like highest tier tanks of the Leopard tree are basically the same as the patterns, but worse. That's all I can say really about the Leopard series. I wouldn't recommend using them in a normal deck. They go slow, they have crap armor for their price, and yeah, the accuracy and AP power is not good enough really to face any sort of packed armor. Only thing I could really recommend them using for is being supportive troops. Okay, so moving on to the Leopard 2. The Leopard 2 is a very good tank. This is like a really good tank. The Leopard 2A4 is the only tank that can take on a TATU 1v1. And the reason I say that is because it's the only tank in the NATO deck that has, on the NATO armory, that has 10 AP power. Now, ATGMs do have more than 10 AP power, but this is the only tank with a main gun of 10 AP power. So, front on, it can take a good long skirmish from a TATU, as long as the TATU doesn't use its ATGM, which it normally won't if you're in range with this cannon anyway, unless the person using the TATU purposely disables the main gun so it makes it use the ATGM, which people might do occasionally. But anyway, the Leopard 2A4 is sort of a must-have. It's very situational though. If you want to use a tank strategy, then yes, it's a must-have. However, in my case, I don't tend to use it because I like to use helicopters and infantry mostly, so I don't tend to use it. But basically, the reason I don't like it is because even though it has a front armor of 10, it has a side armor of 5. And this basically means it can be one shot in the side by an ATGM. That is not good enough to really take an ATGM in the side. So what you have to be really good at with this tank is reversing. And reversing is one thing that I haven't really mentioned before. But basically, you have to right click quite close to the rear of your tank, and it will then go back to that point without turning its hull around, and will prevent it from being shot in the arse when it's trying to drive away. It's quite hard to do, and often you'll accidentally turn around your vehicle. But the best way to turn your vehicle back towards the enemy, if you are accidentally turning your turret or accidentally turning your hull round, is to just right click on them again as though you're going to attack them. That means your tank will then turn its hull towards the enemy you've right clicked on, and will then be in the right position to take an ATGM in the front, which is what you really where you want it to hit, if at all. So yeah, the exceptional stabilizer makes it decent on the move. It basically, I think, keeps its max accuracy of 10 at its max speed of 70 kilometers per hour because of this stabilizer, which makes it awesome. And yeah, that's great. The Leopard 2A1 is also a reasonably good tank with the front armor of 10 again, but it suffers from a lack of accuracy on its main gun, which can be a problem. The stabilizer's not as good, and if we go down to the Leopard 2, then you're losing one front armor and one side armor, which can be problematic against packed tanks of the same sort of tier. So yeah, that's look at the Leopard 2s. The Leopard 2A4 is the only tank that can take on a TATU front. So yeah, bear that in mind. Now moving on to the M1 Abrams, we've got the... Basically, I think I tend to use these quite a lot, and the reason for that is they can take an ATGM in the side. I like tanks that can take ATGMs in the side because they're less of a liability than, for instance, the Leopard 2A4. This has 7 side armor and 9 front armor, which means it's not as good at facing super heavy packed armor, but it does basically hit everything else. And with the exceptional stabilizer on the M1A1 Abrams, you can seriously outmaneuver your enemy with it, although it does suffer from a lack of speed, which I think has been actually nerfed since the last patch. The fuel capacity can be a problem, doesn't get around very well without fuel, and the other variants of this aren't as good as maybe, for instance, the Leopard variants. So although they cost slightly less, they're not as good for their price, or they're not as good value for money as, say, the Leopard 2s are. But the reason I use them is for that side armor, and that accuracy and stabilizer can be very, very useful. Now moving on to the Sheridans. The Sheridans are basically, they're the first cavalry tanks we've come across since I've been talking, and they're useful in packs. That's what I would say. They're the sort of tanks that you bring in 4 of at any one time if you're going to bring them in at all. And the reason for that is because they have crap ATGMs and crap main guns. And the thing you use these tanks for is for that ATGM mostly, I would say. They're basically like mobile ATGM armor, and they cost less, for instance, than the Jaguar 2s and so on. So that's why people bring them in. The ATGM accuracy 4 is terrible, so I would always recommend paying 5 more to get the accuracy of 6 on this ATGM, extra 1 AP power, and also you get an extra 200 range in meters on the ATGM as well. The rest of the stats really stay the same, it's just the ATGM that really gets upgraded. The speed is 70 kilometers per hour, making it very, very good for sort of being reactive defense. and also allows it to fill its role properly of staying out of the range of the enemy heavy tanks. Because if you get into a firefight with a tank with a Sheridan, the Sheridan's going to die very quickly because it only has 2 front armor, 1 side armor, 1 rear armor. It's terrible. It's an absolutely awful tank for going 1v1. What it is good for though is if you do snipe their tanks and then push, because this armor is good enough to sort of take on an autocannon vehicle, and then this main gun can really clear out infantry very easily with a HE power of 4, which is a lot more than, for instance, other guns. Most guns on tanks have a HE power of 3, but these ones have a HE power of 4, which makes them a little bit better against infantry than most other main guns. And that's really what they're good for. Take out the heavy tanks with the ATGMs, then push forwards, preferably with some other support, and use that great sort of average stats to really pound on the enemy, although you only get 15 rounds. But you can see you do get 9 ATGMs, so that's really what people buy them for. The M8AGS, however, even though it is in the Sheridan tree, is basically not a Sheridan. It's like a tiny little thing. It's a lot smaller than it's made out in the picture. It's actually a very small tank. It does go fast. This tank is basically a flanking tank. It's the sort of tank that you would engage with main battle tanks, for instance the Leopards or the M1A1 Abrams, into the front of an enemy tank column or whatever, and then you would use these M8AGSs to sort of go around the side and shoot them in the side armor. And that's what these tanks are used for. Because if they come up front 1v1 versus tanks, they're going to lose because their front armor is only 3, and you don't want to be losing 70 points per tank just because they have 3 front armor. They have a decent stabilizer, and their accuracy is 8, so they can be very accurate on the move occasionally. But basically, the best idea is to just keep them on the flank and use this speed to keep them out of harm's way. Now, moving on to the patterns, these are the most versatile vehicle, or well, most versatile tank on the NATO side. There are multiple variants of this tank, and they are all great value for money. So, the first one is the M60A1 pattern. This is the first variant and has an accuracy of 5 and an AP power of 5, but has no stabilizer. So this is a good defensive tank. This is sort of like the one you would bring in. You think, oh look, there's a bridge, they could rush across that, let's put 4 patterns there, and you've only spent 120 points and you've got a really solid defense. The AOS pattern is better, has a better gun, one more accuracy and 1 more AP power, but the good thing about this tank is it actually has a normal stabilizer. So this tank is more the tank that you can use to sort of outmaneuver your enemy pushes. It's still, I would say, a defensive tank, but it's more reactionary because you can move it around better. I think it's a little bit faster. Yeah, it's actually 10 kilometers per hour faster. So you can actually get it around a lot better, and it's good for a reactionary defense, and also can be used to support attacks. The Rise pattern, again, you get 1 more accuracy and 1 more AP power. You get 10 more kilometers per hour, which then pushes this more towards a rushing tank. That's what it sort of becomes good at, and it really excels at doing so in some cases, as long as you're not bumping into any heavy armor of any sort. The M60A3 is a slightly better version, well, I would say a lot better version of the Rise pattern. However, it does cost 20 points more, but you are getting that extra front armor, which can make a big difference. You've got the normal optics upgrade, and the stabilizer is exactly the same, but you're getting a little bit more accuracy as well. So it's slightly more accurate on the move, and well, the front armor is kind of worth it, but the price again is really the problem here. You can buy 3 tanks for 120 points compared to 2 tanks for 120 points. So it's really that kind of trade-off that you're really doing there. So moving on to the Super M60, this is, I would say, another good pushing tank, but it's not like, it's a tank that you'd bring in and then the enemy will go, oh crap, he's got super M60s, and then bring in like a T80, and then you're fucked. Because the front armor and side armor isn't the best. It's a good tank, I'm not gonna lie, but it's always countered by something. That's the trouble with it. It's like, it costs a lot, but it can be one shot by an HDGM. It costs a lot, and people can just bring in an enemy tank which is better for like the same cost. So it's pretty ridiculous. It's one of those tanks that I just kind of ignore, and I tend to only use really the first 3 variants of the patterns, but the other 2 are viable. It's just that they do cost a lot more, so you've got to know what you're doing with them, which is basically be very careful, because they can be countered easily. Now moving on to the Starships, you've got basically a tank that's exactly the same as the Sheridan. It fills exactly the same role, but it's worse overall. And the reason for that is because if you look at the upgraded Starship, the actual HDGM doesn't upgrade compared to what it does on the Sheridan. So you see it remains at 4 accuracy on here because it's got the Shilleler, or whatever that is, HGM name. And then this has got the Shilleler C, and it's got 6 accuracy instead. And as you can see, the other stats also get worse. So it's slower, it's got worse optics, it's got worse fuel, it's generally worse. So you just got to really take my word for it. You don't want both of these on the deck at the same time. You want one or the other, and the Sheridan's better. That's all I can say. The MBT. Now this is a weird tank. It's one of those tanks that a lot of people love to take just because it's got all those armaments I was talking about at the beginning. And yeah, it's alright until you realise that they have like a T80 or a high level T72B or whatever, and then you're like, oh shit. Yeah, because it actually doesn't have a great amount of armor for what its intended purpose is. I'm not even sure what its intended purpose is. It's like too many things on it. You've got an HDGM that has an accuracy of 6, which for a cost of 75 isn't even worth it. You've got a main gun which doesn't really do enough damage with the 6 AP power to hit a tank effectively. And then you've got an autocannon which barely ever gets into range because the tank gets killed too quickly. So it's one of those tanks I would definitely avoid once you get used to the game. You want tanks that are specific to a role rather than a tank that fills every role. The KPZ-70, although I haven't unlocked it, I do know quite a bit about this tank from previous discussions with other people. But basically what this tank's good for is its AP power. That's what a lot of people buy it for, if they buy it at all. But most people prefer to buy like the Leopard 2s instead of this, because they say the Leopard 2 only costs like 10 more, and you get in like the same AP power but like a better tank in general. So a lot of people just have the Leopard 2s in their deck and then just use that instead. So you can see the difference here is the speed is worse, the armor, especially on the front and side, is actually worse than the Leopard 2. The fuel capacity is worse on the KPZ-70. So yeah, it's just an awful tank, really. I would definitely stay away from these 2 bomb tanks unless you really, really want to give them a go. But yeah, that's about it. Hopefully you guys have liked this overview of the tanks. I tried to go into a little bit more detail than I did on my other ones. The reason... Anyway, what I would suggest doing, my recommended tanks, you kind of need the Leopard 2A4 if you're going to take on a T80U. That is the only tank that can take it on 1v1, and the patterns are the most versatile tank in the NATO tree. The Sheridans are the best cavalry tanks out of the Starships, and the Sheridans, basically the Sheridan's better. And well, be careful using most of the other tanks because they can get destroyed very easily. M1A 1 Abrams is good for taking HGMs in the side, Challenger 1's good for slow pushes, etc. So yeah, hopefully you guys have enjoyed this one. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. If you have like any general comments about what you think in terms of some of these vehicles, my opinion is not always right, obviously. Some people may disagree with what I say, so I don't really have a problem with that as long as you can back it up. But yeah, thanks for watching, guys. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you've learned something. Hope it's been very insightful. But yeah, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.